Please.
Yes, indeed, Chair. For those who carry on, Ethan. For those who haven't got their app downloaded, it's up on the wall here. There's our Karakia. And you could join with me, please. Whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta. Kia mā tara tara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura. He teo, he hoka, he hauhu, ti hei mauniora. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Pepe. I have an apology from Charles Councillor Lambert. He's had a tangi he has to be attended to a relative, so sad. And I have not an apology, but we have Martin Williams, Councillor Williams online.
Morning.
Morning.
And I also have an apology from Mike Paku. Would someone move the apologies be sustained? Craig Kenywai. All those in favour say aye. Carried. Notices? Any notices? There's no notices I'm aware of. Conflict of interest declarations. Anybody conflicted? Declared? Being none. Move to the minutes of the 30th of June. They've been circulated. Are there any errors or omissions people would like to highlight? None have been advised to me. Councillor Foss, would you like to move the minutes?
I will, thank you, Chair.
Councillor Van Beek. I'll put the minutes. All those in favour will say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Carried. Follow-ups from the previous meeting. The Executive, you take us through the follow-ups.
Chair, so just two follow-ups there, the first of which is underway in terms of a revised Karamu Catchment Enhancement Plan. So that will come forward to Council before the end of the year, and also the invitation to Takaha Waikarangi's presentation had been sent. So that will go to a future Māori Committee meeting. So both of those undertaken.
Any questions, any comments people would like to make on that? Someone move the follow-ups be received. Do you like to do that? Councillor Curtin?
Moved.
Councillor Foley? All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Carried. Significant organisational activities.
Chair, can we take the paper as read, please? And
Sure.
we're happy to take any questions.
Questions, starting from my left, Van Beek, Foley. Yes.
Thanks, Chair. Just perhaps just a quick brief from Chris Dolly around the start of the Apatoki gravel extraction project. We obviously approved that at the LTP, and just, is that underway?
Yep, so I'll just whiz up the front.
Oh, please.
There's a microphone there too.
Okay, I think there's the chair, the one with the electric wires on it. I think we need this and the light in front of it.
Saving a lot of money.
Sorry.
I thought I'm with my name. I should have sat here.
Sure.
Excellent. So, look, it's great that that funding was approved through the LTP process. We've been doing a huge amount of background study. So we've done some comprehensive materials testing, and that information is now back from the labs, and we'll be sharing that testing with industry so they understand the quality, or an indicator of the quality at the various locations. We've also looked at the priority of all of the locations on the 5 rivers so we can prioritise the extraction sites. We've put in, I think, 3 additional access roads already. We have a request for information out widely in the contracting industry around rates for extraction, and we recently had another meeting with the community to give them an update around that information. And we also have a meeting, I think, this Friday with industry to talk about our contracting opportunities. In addition to that, we've had separate meetings with many of the large players in the gravel industry around potential opportunities for them, and that's particularly in the reduction of material from the Nararoro. So I think we're well positioned to really start putting some contracts together over the next couple of months, and then it will be full steam ahead. We're fully cognisant we need to work through issues with tangata whenua and also the community in terms of traffic and access, but the team are are well onto that. So I think we're well positioned. It might look like nothing has happened, but there's a huge amount of technical information that's been done, so we can target the right areas and provide particularly that indication of quality to industry, because there are different quality of aggregates, and it's important that they know, what they're getting. So hopefully that covers
Thank you.
your inquiry.
Right, stop. Satisfied with that? Councillor Ormsby, got any questions on the plan? Company? Councillor Foss?
Thanks. Just regarding the Bayview Whirinaki Cycleway, the update says project on hold pending resolution of land matters with NCC.
Yep.
So are we in some kind of dispute with NCC, or is it a third party?
Yep.
Can you give us more information, please?
Yep. So there's certainly no dispute between councils. The majority of that trail will be owned by Napier City Council. HBRC just happens to be project managing the project because it was a part of a package of projects. There are some issues with land acquisition, and because Napier City Council will effectively end up owning and operating that cycleway, they really need to make those decisions at their council level about their appetite for land acquisition. In addition, there was a strip made available through a subdivision consent, and that consent has now lapsed. And so we really feel that those are issues that the Napier City Council need to resolve, and they need to be resolved for that project to go forward. If they're unable to be resolved, we can't get from A to B. Effectively, we'd need to look for an alternate route.
Okay, so I see you've got some papers coming to the executive teams in August. Could you just keep us briefed
Yep.
on progress there? Because that's quite disappointing. Thanks for the explanation, but it's disappointing that, for example, the consent has lapsed, but maybe there's some other reasons why. So please.
Yeah, so this is a, sorry, I wasn't clear. The consent is a development consent, and so the developer hasn't renewed that consent, and that consent allowed for a strip of land.
Right.
So it's probably right that that did lapse, but it just means there's an additional complication around procuring that land.
Thanks.
Councillor Curtin?
No, I don't.
Yes. Michelle?
Kia ora, koutou. So just again with the Northern Catchments, I note Nathan's report there, and there's some additional stuff that's happened. There was some planting on the 22nd of July in the Rotongaio Lake at Pūtere, Ngāti Pauhurira. We had a hui with Minister Kiritapu Allen on the last Friday, 23rd of July. So I mentioned the state of the Namotu and Whakamahi lagoons, and Dog had been in charge of that all those decades, and we're left with a munded wetland and no resourcing. So Doc are going to be talking with us on how we can work through that. We've got the Deputy Prime Minister in Wairoa today, Wairoa College, and the other thing is I need to advise that there's been an occupation of the Tauranga school lands around concerns for proposed limestone quarrying on Puaturoa Station. And this is with the some of the manas whenua. So as my other hat I hold as chair of Te Hononga o Ngā Awa, these are nai kohatu, some of our people who are part of our kahui. So we represented with the tono, and the flag is flying and our people are concerned. One of the things, the presentations from one of the whānau there, and this is Api's people, was that she showed us, so when it rains, the water comes out of a rock, literally, and it comes out aqua. I've only seen aqua one other time in the country, and it's over in Wairua, Pehu, and that water is pure. And what will the limestone quarrying do to that source? And they have a roto. It's a cultural place where they baptise and practice their tohi there. So yes, very big concern for the whānau, to the point that they're looking, well, they have occupied And there will be tautoko from our people to go there. So it's all because of the vicinity, it's close to Whakapūnake, everybody's concerned. That's our maunga, that's our tipuna maunga, it's sacred to our people. It's our pipia, ko Whakapūnake te maunga. It's like the wairo, te wairo hōpupu honinganingi mātangi rau te awa. So it is part of it's part of our manunga, of our heart. So received that and just wanted that noted because Nathan wouldn't know that. That only happened this week and they are there and they want their voices heard and their concern. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you. Right. Someone moved that the Assembly
Mr.
Organisation...
Chairman.
Oh, sorry,
Mr.
Martin?
Chairman. Yeah, just one question for Chris on the stop banks. If you could just give us some detail around the significant work that's required for the lower Tukituki Rarotonga Plains scheme that has been identified through the modelling.
Yeah, so look, just at a high level, it's that's more around the crest height of those stop banks, and so what we'll be doing is, I think, bring a more detailed piece of work to the next Environment Committee meeting. I haven't got all of the detail here with me, but it's effectively what we found for the rest of the scheme. The crest height was generally good for a 1 in 500 year event. In the lower Tukituki, we need to do some work around the crest height. So that will go in the mix with the prioritisation of the areas. And it was really just updating council that previously we thought that the crest height was okay, but in the lower Tukituki area, it needs a bit of work. So we can bring more detail to the next EICC meeting on that one.
Thank you. And just one other question, if I may, Mr. Chair.
You may.
The policy implementation, whole of region, item 5, a range of activities, etc., and helping prepare farmers for nationwide expectations. Quarterly reporting to government on actions improvements is required. Is that reporting by the regional council or by the farmers? Just explain that a bit, if you could please.
It's by regional councils to the Ministry for the Environment on implementation of those of the rollout of those regulations, and that was part of the requirement that arose from the deferment by 12 months of the intensive winter grazing regulations. So ministers gave 12 months reprieve, but only on the basis that progress was made in the meantime, and wanted quarterly reporting from regional councils for that.
Thank you very much. Very clear. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Will someone care to move the report be received? Sheriff?
Second.
Will? All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Carried. Minor items? Any minor items for the agenda? Being none, we'll move on to item 6, setting the rates for 2021-22 financial year.
Thank you, Chair. So Ross Franklin, our acting Chief Financial Officer, is here to answer any questions. Obviously, this is derived from the long-term plan decisions that were adopted on the 30th of June and flows through now to the rate setting. Once Council has resolved to set these rates, we will commence the process over the next month of issuing invoices to ratepayers. So, Ross, is there anything you wanted to add in relation to the paper?
Probably just highlight that we do have the 20th of September due date this year. It was going to be 20th of September last year, but as you're aware, ratepayers were given more time last year because of COVID, but obviously, there'll be a strong comms campaign to remind ratepayers of the 20th of September due date, which is a change from previous years.
I see, Ross, that you've got some things here to 5 decimal places. Have you checked every one of these to assure me personally that you are very happy that it goes to 0.333333?
I can assure you I have, and the rates team have. It doesn't look a lot on paper, but there's a lot of checking and cross-checking that goes in behind these.
Okay, any questions or comments people would like to make? It seems it's a pretty straightforward paper. Councillor Curtin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for newbies new to this, can you tell me
What page are you on?
we're on page 16. Page 16. General rate, equalised land value, uniform annual general charge, differential target rate, equalised capital value. Can you just tell me the difference between the general rate and uniform annual general charge?
Yes, I can. The uniform annual general charge is a portion of the general rate that council chooses to charge on a uniform amount per separately used or inhabited portion of a property. So, and that's another definition, per separately used or inhabited portion of a property. It means, for example, if you've got a block of flats on one rating assessment, say there's 3 flats, there will be 3 uniform annual charges charged to that block of flats.
And do you spend the money differently?
No, it's just part of the, it's just a subset of the general rate.
Sure. Second question, equalised land value.
That comes about because you are a regional council, because all of the territorial councils have a different revaluation date. So we get a certificate from quotable value each year, which effectively says as at a date, I think September date they do it, this is the value of all land and land value and capital value, for example, for Wairau District, for Hastings District, for Napier City, for Central Hawke's Bay, so that it actually puts everybody on a level playing field for the purposes of rate setting. And then from that, then it translates into a calculation based on the actual land value or capital value of that district, so everybody is treated equally.
And land value?
The same occurs in terms of it's obviously different rates. We have decided whether we'll charge based on land value or capital value, so it's determined based on the council's policies in terms of how the rates will be applied.
Greatly informed.
Does he get a prize for getting all 3 right?
Yes, tick, tick, tick.
Oh, very good. Any other questions? Councillor Foss.
Questions, please. Just on page 17, in and around the various streams and drainage schemes, do the targeted ratepayers in those areas, are they rated the same regardless of if something's deemed a stream or a drain?
Each one is defined quite differently. A lot of these actually go back. I can bring out what's called a special order, which goes back to the 1990s. This stream or drain, that's just, I suppose, terminology, which links to the actual definition of the scheme.
Is it perhaps?
And each scheme has got effectively a boundary drawn in terms of which properties are included in that scheme, and the amount of money is divided into those after allowance for the fact that each of the schemes does have an allocation of rates, general rates, which varies according to council policy.
Sure. So, because a stream by its various nature is a drain. But anyway, I know this is not really the finance area. I'm just trying to find if there is actually a boundary somewhere.
Correct, and it's some of the existing wording that we're just rolling forward.
Some of the drains.
I think the determinant in this, as I understand it, is the nature of the work and the cost of the work for the protection, regardless of whether it's called a drain or a stream.
Yes, yes, I figure, and so, great, now I'm sure that will come up in the other discussions we're going to have around those areas, but that's fine. The other question was on page 19, if you just describe a little bit more the animal pest targeted rate, you go down by the various districts, just to be page 19, sorry, just to be clear, that is, so we're raising $101,000 for pest control out of the forestry sector, of which the forestry sector themselves will utilise that in the forests as opposed to someone like Osprey, is that correct?
No, this is collecting funding for council and council-run programs.
So this, okay, so that's...
This is the money that the council directly spends, not what people are doing themselves. And
look, I can comment on that. And at that volume, that's effectively funding monitoring. So that's not direct possum control, for example, within, which is obviously animal pest within the forestry. Obviously, $100,000 wouldn't buy you much possum control, so it funds monitoring, if you like, and that might result in the requirement for action to be taken by a landowner if an infestation of possums is detected, for example.
Okay, so that probably answers my second question then. So given plant pest strategy is about 576,000, animal strategy 1.7 mil plus that 101, so that's what that is it?
Correct.
Animal strategy is pests.
Yep, correct.
Thank you.
Councillor
Two questions. Kia ora, Ross. As a newbie, and I'll just be a bit pedantic here, but in 2.3.1, we have the Heretaunga Plains Flood Control Scheme, and then it talks about the rates set on equalised land value, but then on the table below it, it's equalised capital value in that column.
Correct. Perhaps we may need to suggest we
Yeah.
amend that.
So that appears three
That's a
times.
typo?
Yeah, so that appears 3 times in the paper, where the
Well spotted.
descriptor says land value, but then in the table it's a
Equalised
different
land
value.
So which is
Thank
correct?
you for picking that up.
That's well spotted. That's the for the newbie. It's done very well.
I've got a
That's the-
second question after this.
And I just before we go, just what I want to know precisely, which is incorrect? The equalised land value is incorrect, or the equalised capital value is incorrect? Is it correct in the narrative or the table?
Yeah, hang on.
So for the Heretaunga Flood Scheme, I think the answer is land, but
Yeah. That links back to our funding impact statement.
just need to double
We've
check
got
that.
all these described. I'm going to double check.
Because once we've agreed it, you can't change it.
No, that's exactly right.
But maybe this paper needs to be
Capital value.
corrected before we pass it.
Equalised
But
capital.
that's what we're doing. If you
Well,
get
we
to
can-
tell
we
us
can-
what
table's
the
right.
correction is, we'll
Yeah,
then
table's
put it on
right.
paper.
It is
Table's
capital
right.
value.
The table's
capital.
right, it is
Table's
capital.
right, heading is wrong.
Yeah.
It appears also in 2.43, again, same issue. And then in 2.4.4.11.
For
So I think all of the descriptors say land value, but
The tables.
the table says differently.
there's been some cutting and pasting.
So that's when you go, if you wish to move the motion, you should move an amendment to say that the
Yes.
narrative has changed from equalised land value to equalised capital value.
Do the staff want to go and double check that I haven't missed one
No,
of the
you-
three?
told you, no, you're actually right. It is the capital value which is rated against, not the land value.
Yes, and the tables are right. So what we did in terms of a modification in terms of clarification, we added the wording up above to try and link into the table. So obviously some of those
We
cut
just
and
need to
paste.
change the
Yeah.
language on the
So
paper.
I appreciate you picking those up. Thank you.
Councillor of the day.
Next question?
Day's not over yet.
Taking an early lead.
And just the second question is, if we look at all the tables and take a step back and we compare land value versus capital value in terms of how we rate, whether it be through schemes or otherwise, around what percentage do we rate capital versus land?
I can't tell you, but the biggest of the rates is general rate, which is land value.
Yeah.
And it's small, we get into some of the schemes, which are capital value.
And
It's-
why do we do that?
It's council policy decision. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's
okay.
part of a process that council goes through in defining its rates, which I understand from the LTP council's looking at doing and having another look at. So, and there's a big philosophical discussion that often goes on between land value, capital value, in terms of what's more appropriate. So if you think of land value, it's only the value of the land. Capital value is the land and improvements on the land. So you might want to take, for example, in terms of who the beneficiaries are, say it's flood control works, is it protecting the land plus what's on the land, or is it just something that's purely relating to the land? Because you also have, reasonably well used within the rating structure is an area basis. And all of these there is a limited toolbox that's available under the Local Government Rating Act in terms of how you can actually, the basis on which you can collect, but those are some of the tools that you have in the toolbox.
Generally, I think you could say that the rural-based flood schemes are based on land value or area, and the more urban, which is the Heretaunga Plains scheme in particular, is based on capital value, because obviously protecting more homes and businesses and capital assets.
So, does that,
Yeah, it gives
Yeah.
me a good, better picture.
shall I just keep going around? Back to you for a
Just
supplementary question.
Yeah, supplementary, Mr Chair,
Helping the
and a
newbies
great
again.
question from Councillor Ormsby, still Councillor of the Day in my book. Great question, because if we can go back to the general rate, Ross, and
What number?
this is at 2.1. 2.1 at page 16.
Yeah.
Just to round out Councillor Ormsby's inquiry, you'll see their differential rate calculation factor there, cents in the dollar. Just help us out with why people in Wairoa pay 0.032226 cents versus those in Napier, I can understand, but 0.2749 cents. So just rounding out Councillor Ormsby's...
It's a mathematical calculation driven by the fact that we're using that equalised land value. So effectively the total of the amount that we require is divided into the total value of the equalised value, and that equalised value tells us how much we want to collect from each of the territorial local authorities. We then divide the amount that we need to collect from each of the territorial authorities into the actual land value for each of those, because, as I say, it's the value they've got. We're dealing with, land that was revalued last year, land that was revalued 2 or 3 years ago.
I totally get that, Ross, and thank you for that. We could take a whole day to go through this, but once your land's equalised in value, you've determined its equalised value, then we apply a rate, a differential rate calculation to it. Why do we do that?
It's not a differential rate.
Right.
We've got to be very careful in terms of a differential rate is where you actually have, from a policy, it's different because the land values are different, and because they're being revalued on a different date. So we can only rate based on the actual land value in the rating database, and that's when it was last revalued. So, for example, land, we'll say Luwara, for example, land was revalued, say 2 years ago. That land, when it was revalued, was worth $100,000. In today's market, that land's worth $200,000, and Napier's just had a revaluation, and an equivalent piece of land is worth $200,000. Because it was revalued 2 years ago, we have to use the $100,000 to actually charge the rate. So the rate in the dollar has to be twice to collect the same amount, and so apples for apples in terms of each ratepayer being treated equally.
Chair, can I help out here? Because I think I understand the question, and that is, why have we got one variable which is the equalisation of land value, and then a variable calculation factor? I think what you're saying, Ross, and just confirm if I've got this right, is that our rates are calculated on actual land value, but the setting is based on these variable calculation numbers, the different numbers you've got in the column, to achieve the equalisation. So while it says their rates are set on equalised land value, they're only set on equalised land value by virtue of the variable calculation factor.
Yes, it's the equalised value determines, because where you've got, it only applies where we are collecting rates from more than one territorial local authority.
Yep.
And the equalised value determines the proportion you collect from each of those territorial authorities, which then gets converted into that variable rate applied to the actual
value,
official value on their that appears on their rate demand.
Are you satisfied with the answer, Councillor?
Yes, I am, and my apologies for putting you through
that
agony.
I think it's actually very good that you're doing that, because rating is the heart of the whole organisation.
Chair.
Wow.
If you didn't rate, you wouldn't exist because you wouldn't have any money.
Right, Ross is
I'll
exactly,
try and do anything without it, get it.
Ross is exactly right. So, we've got the question, so would,
I think Councillor.
Yeah, just a further point of clarification on how you got to those different calculation factors. So you said a valuation might have been done 2 years ago at 100,000. It might be worth 200,000 now. Who's deciding it's now worth 200,000?
The quotable value,
Quotable value.
our appointed valuer. So they do the revaluation for each. I think they do all of the revaluation for all of the territorial councils. They then provide a certificate which says, as at this date, and they comply with all this. There's a whole piece of legislation in terms of valuation rules.
Yeah, sorry, I don't think you got the question right. So that, QV do that at different years for different TAs.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you're saying if one was valued today, one was valued 2 or 3 years ago, there's an unfairness. Are they giving you interim?
They give us a certificate every year, which says, as at this point in time, this is the value for Waira, Hastings, Napier, Central Hawke's Bay, Rankatiki, Taupo.
Okay.
in a global sum, and then you take global properties and
And then we
derive
use
to
that to do the maths to actually convert it back as to how much
Okay.
proportionately each one should pay.
Councillor Williams, you got any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one in similar vein to my colleagues. I just really want to make sure I've got my head around this completely. There's a set of tables with differential rates dealing principally with the flood control schemes. And I see calculation factors that vary depending whether you're in area A or F, and they're all different until I get down to on page 19. Animal pest control, the cents per hectare seems to be the same across each district for both for plant pest strategy, regional animal strategy. Is that still a differential rate?
No, that is not a differential rate. We show it against, how much. That's more shown to say how much we're collecting from each of those territorial authorities, but it is on a uniform basis across the whole area.
Well, it's under a heading that says the following differential targeted rates. So is it in the wrong part of the table? And it probably doesn't matter. But
Bearing in mind, there's the differential rate because forestry.
Oh, yeah.
So there is a differential rate applied to forestry, has a different factor
right.
to the others.
Conversely, the uniform targeted rates in 2.4 on page 20 has different calculation factors across central and southern area, rivers and streams. Is that in the right part of the table, and does it matter if it's not?
I'm just... Which reference? The central rivers and streams.
2.4.
That's because it's equal. Again, that's because we're using the equalised capital value. It has to be equalised because of the different valuations of the different area districts.
But it's still a uniform targeted rate.
Yes, it's still effectively set on a uniform rate because it's set on a uniform basis, but it's just because the valuations are different within those areas.
Right, thank you.
Okay.
Happy to move. Happy to move if you like.
I thought Councillor Ormsby was going to
I'll
move
second that.
the recommendations with the amendment that the language be changed from, what was it again? Let's make sure we get this right.
Would you just like me to point out which parts need to be changed to reflect what's in the table?
You can do that if
So-
Leanne's quick enough to capture it.
So the amendments would be to 2.3.1.
2.31, so it's equalised capital value rather than land value.
Yep.
2.3.1, what's the other place?
Is 2.4.2.
2.4.2.
And that should read based on capital value. 2.4.3, which should be based on capital value.
Capital value, equalised capital value.
And 2.4.4.11, which should be based on capital value.
Capital value, okay. So with those amendments, you are happy to move the all the points 1 to 5, as amended.
Second.
Councillor Curtin would like to second that. Would you like to speak, Councillor Ormsby?
No, I'll leave that to my colleague.
Yes, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair.
I'd welcome it, actually.
Thank you. And and I'd just like to essentially endorse what Ross had to say about the role that the team in finance play in bringing this together. It's not easy. It's very complex, and part of the rationale for actually inquiring in more depth around it is to acknowledge the great work that's done by the finance team, and thank you for stepping in, Ross, and fulfilling the role that you are presently. It just reflects on what a good team and good staff we have. Further comment I'd like to make, Mr. Chair, and thanks to Councillor Ormsby for raising the general rate issue, uniform general charge, is that we've got something like $13 million of generally rated funding, which every person in the region gets a benefit from and contributes towards. And it doesn't matter whether they are renting a property or the like. Ultimately, they are contributing to that generally funded pool. And further to that, they are contributing a further $10 million that is derived from our investments. Each citizen of the region is a shareholder in those investments. So in total, something like 23 million is the generally funded rate. So we all benefit from that. And sometimes we don't quite recognise or acknowledge that reality. The part of the rationale for examining a little more closely those differentials in rating, and particularly the uniform general charge, is that we do have best endeavours to try and achieve equity between our respective people in the region, no matter their wealth and their status, is to recognise that we do need to have some level of differential. We've got a uniform annual general charge, which everyone pays, but we also have differentials based either on land value, equalised land value, or capital value. So we're doing our best to ensure that everyone gets a fair go in this. And there was a lot of debate, I can recall, around the table, particularly around the desire to increase the uniform general charge so that everyone pays equally. Well, that's simply not viable in the community we live in, and I think we have arrived at a more equitable way of funding the work that we do through the rating system. But finally, Mr. Chair, thanks to the team for pulling this together. This is where the rubber hits the road. It is the heart of the work we do, and it's where we interface with our community at the most fundamental level.
Any other speakers? Well, I'd just like to say thank you to Ross and the team. This is a mind-numbing, eye-watering exercise. Honestly, New Zealand has wrestled with rates and rating systems for 100+ years with all sorts of things, and it's pretty well constrained as to what you can do. There's only various options, and we've been up and down as communities about who gets the benefit, who pays the cost, and it's been a well-argued case, and there's some pretty rigid formula for it, which people have to work through. It's complicated work, and without this, we can't operate. So you're quite right. This is where the very important stuff comes. And no doubt there'll be others out there who will look at examine these, all these fine numbers, to make sure that it's exactly right. So we'll have some people who will examine them and will test our assumptions. So good work, well done, and thank you. All right, put the motion. All those in favour will say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Carried. So we've got rates to carry on. Next item, 7, coastal hazards.
We'll go and spend it now, shall we?
Sorry?
We'll go and spend it now, shall we?
I've got Simon as well. So
Okay. So you're going to lead some introduction on this, are you, Chris?
yes, I thought I'd just make a few introductory comments.
A few introductory comments.
And then hand it over for discussion. Everyone knows Simon Bendel. He's the
Simon.
project manager for the coastal project, so he's here for all the tricky questions. Look, you'll recall this issue has been on a bit of a journey for many years. So the coastal strategy has been going since 2014. So for 7 years, we've been working through a lot of the technical issues. And one of the challenging issues to resolve through the 3 councils involved was who would ultimately take responsibility for execution of a coastal strategy. So we've been working through that for a number of years, and we got Raynor Asher on board to help us through that process, and a copy of his paper is attached to this paper. We've been through the joint committee, so that's representatives from this council, Napier City Council, and the Hastings District Council. And the Coastal Joint Committee recommended that the Regional Council take responsibility for all aspects of execution of our coastal strategy. And then that recommendation went to the EICC Committee where it was discussed, and it was recommended that the EICC Committee that recommendation be taken to the full council. So that's where we are at today. So we have been working on this for 7 years. There's a huge amount of work that's gone behind developing the strategy, huge amount of engagement with primarily the population at risk, but also a number of organisations and tangata whenua with interests in that coastal area. So it's been a huge effort. What we're asking for today is really in principle commitment. We've got a whole raft of steps to go through, and this is really just indicating that the Regional Council would or would not be interested in taking a primary role. But we still need to work through a memorandum of transition, so that's looking at the detail of how actually it would occur. We still need to go through an LTP amendment process, pre-consultation, and then consultation with the whole community. So a decision on who is going to be responsible for taking this forward is really important for those next steps. So we're not signing away the whole farm, we're really indicating that we're willing to go on this journey, acknowledging that there's some more information to come. So I think that's probably where I'll leave it there, Chair. We're happy to...
Would you like to make a few introductories?
It's covered it well, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to ask the Chair to lead this for us. So,
Okay, good. Thank you, Chris and Simon for doing the work and putting the paper together. And as you say, this has taken a long time, especially with the other TAs and the settlement groups. I've just got just a question really to give a little bit more clarification. Table 1 in the paper, how, and I won't use a pun, although I could do, how firm is this program that we see there in front of us as indicated by the table?
So what we can comment is following the MFE guidance, it is an adaptive process. So we're certainly not locking in the 100-year view. Certainly there's been a huge amount of consultation and effort to go into this particular series of pathways for each cell. They have been presented to Council a couple of years ago now. But under the adaptive framework, one of the benefits is that if things are different, if the sea level is rising faster or slower than anticipated, we can change that pathway. And so that's what the triggers and signals is about. And so part of this work is looking at what are the signals, what are the triggers that we would use to get from one pathway to the next, or change pathways. So we have said in the paper that that this strategy is basically on a 10-year review cycle, and for infrastructure, a 10-year review cycle is about right, in my view. It doesn't mean that the previous work is incorrect, but what it is a mechanism to take the latest thinking, build that into the pathways, and check, are these pathways still the right way to go? So they are adaptive by nature. We're certainly not locking in any of those solutions beyond 20 years, because there will be an opportunity to both review the strategy but also review the triggers and signals and the technical inputs to the analysis.
And they were revised in 2021, correct?
Pardon?
They were revised in 2021.
The technical...
Table 1s
Table
and its
one.
pathways.
Yes, so there's been a
Current.
few minor amendments through some of the work we did. So, for example, we did some work in the regulatory area that indicated that a stop bank around the estuary would most likely be a prohibited activity. And so we took that back to our panel and reassessed those options. So that's why it is slightly amended this year.
Yep.
And also questions around, or question around Table 2 and Table 3. We really, because this funding issue has been a real conundrum for the Joint Committee, we really haven't had a lot of time getting these numbers together. Can you just give us a bit of a vision on view of how we actually got there and how long this has taken us?
Yeah, so in terms of the project as a whole, so all these particular numbers here. So I think Tonkin and Taylor initially did a whole lot of the technical work around the options and came up with some wide envelope costs for the 100-year strategy, and that was in the, potentially the hundreds of millions of dollars. From there, we've effectively done a concept design for each cell, and then also optimised the design. So what I mean by optimise the design, around the Te Wanga Hamoana area, the initial costs were based on holding the coast at the exact location it is now. And we were able to optimise that by protecting more around the built environment and providing a lower level of protection for the natural environment. And the land use was around reserves and things like that. So that enabled the costs to come down significantly. These tables represent the costs for the first tranche. So when we look at Table 1, the first 0 to 20 years in those priority cells. And so certainly the capital costs are reasonably well understood, are well understood, and certainly the operational costs in terms of the gravel renourishment have been taken at a midpoint of the upper Tuki scheme. So they've been, we've built a fair amount of distance into that haulage rate, and we've also built the carbon offset cost into that haulage rate as well. So again, we're confident with those numbers. We have allowed, in terms of consenting, you need to read the operating and capital tables together. So before we're constructing our first asset, we've effectively got $1 million for consenting activities and pre-consenting activities, and 2 full-time staff on top of our existing capability in that area. So there's a reasonable amount of work behind it. However, it is a starting point, and further work needs to be done. And what we haven't probably factored in is any significant challenges to that process. So that's something we may want to consider going forward. But it's a broad brush to indicate when we look at a very coarse way, because of course most likely it would be a targeted rate scheme, but we've boiled it down to an impact per ratepayer. And so you can see there, if it was charged as a uniform charge rather than a targeted rate, it gives a feel of the affordability around $100 a ratepayer by year 10.
Well, I had a bit of an issue with that because it's never going to be a general charge.
No.
But the point is, it's
I
not
understand the point.
tens
but
of
that's-
thousands. Yep.
Yeah, no, I understand. I would have preferred you just to have left it at what the quantum was,
Yep.
rather than do that, because it does give a different feel from my perspective of that. So anyway, sorry about that. Any other questions?
No, that's super.
Explain first.
Okay, Craig?
Thanks. Three points. Can you just describe in para 66, what does a storm surge barrier actually look like to a non-engineering person? If I looked out and saw one, what am I looking at?
So the storm surge barrier that we've looked at based on, I think, Dutch technology is effectively a subsurface structure that is unseen most of the time. And when there is a storm surge, which is effectively the sea level rising as a result of a storm and low pressure, is enabled to be deployed to prevent the sea coming in. So it effectively blocks the harbour entrance for the duration of that particular
Is
event.
this something mechanical, like the Thames River barrier in London or something?
Yeah, so there's different ones. I think the ones we were looking at were more of an inflatable style. And there's a huge amount of work. So it's at an early concept only. We really struggled in the amount of work we did because of the specialised nature. Doing additional design was well over $100,000. But because of the issues around the prohibited activity status and because of the large area, it's something that we need to look into, with a bit more detail.
Simple answers. Quite often they put them in the, like raise the sea floor, so when the wave comes in, the amount of water above it is much diminished. So therefore it dissipates a lot of energy, so the wave goes up and loses energy, and therefore doesn't reach as far as it can do.
So
Like a surf break.
So this one
Surf break.
excludes the sea.
Okay, I'm quite interested in what that may look like. So presumably that's in conjunction with communications with the port, because you describe here it'll be at the harbour entrance.
So this is for the inner harbour. So it's
Inner
clearly
harbour, Pandora.
not the port. It's the inner harbour. So it's the recreational vessel, yacht club, and the estuary.
Okay.
Second question.
58, where the excerpt from the report from Jack Holder QC in his LGNZ report. I'm very supportive of us taking a lead. Not much has happened in this space. No problem with that at all. But then my next step is, of course, a cautious one. And so in here they describe, for example, there are an increasing number of climate change cases being litigated around the world, and it goes on to describe some of those. So I'm concerned that how we manage that as we take the lead with historic decisions and issues may lead to cases in the future, and where we seem to be taking the lead and grasping that and bringing all that into our tent. So that then dictates my caution in and around this, because there's a whole lot that we don't know, such as what I've just asked. And then if you could just go to the MOU or the transition, it links to this in the recs there. With respect to what I was just saying there about the legal situations, the other councils here have made decisions in and around infrastructure and subdivision, at best around sea level, for example, the Te Awa subdivisions, etc. If, as we take a lead and take all things coastal hazard, climate change, flooding, coastal hazard on board, I'm very concerned that we inherit the liability that they may have incurred, unknowingly, I'm sure, onto this council. And so an MOU is quite soft, and a transition is nice and cuddly, and if I was one of those councils, I'd be feeding the backs real fast. So can I ask, or have you thought, or at least can I put on the table, that is much stronger than an MOU, and it outlines these potential liabilities of previous decisions and where we take responsibility from what date of what? Can we make it much harder than just an MOU?
Could I answer the question for you? I think the MOU is simply the starter. That they'll go on, there'll be iterations and other things will come on. We will come to a much harder document later on. With that, there's no doubt. I just think the MOU is the sort of, the invitation to the dance. We haven't concluded anything yet, that's my view, and we'd have to have a very firm, clear document that outlines all of that. Secondly, with regards to Te Awa, my view is this, is that any decision the council's made like that, the consequences, the liability, the long term for that decision rests with them. We are not going to inherit anybody else's liabilities in that regard. What we will have to be clear about is if we take over the assets as an asset, like a groin or this, we'll need to be very clear about what it is that the liability that's associated with that, the depreciation, the maintenance, all those things. We'll have to have all of those risks outlined, and we'll have to satisfy ourselves we've got as much as we can covered. And what we don't know or haven't been told will rest with the council. So we'll have to be very clear on our due diligence. I agree with you 100% on that.
Thank you, Chair. That's good. So then that MOU, because this document doesn't say what we've just discussed here. It doesn't even allude to it.
No.
And I'm very concerned that it doesn't. And if we can we'll go a minute the discussion anyway as we progress through, and other colleagues have got
So I think take that on board. I think it's an important part of the MOU to outline responsibilities and transfer of risk and what risks are certainly not being
and the Chair's correct. The MOU won't do that, but the MOU will describe the action taken to do exactly this and clear lines of demarcation.
Well, could I just suggest to you, Councillor Foster, you have a look at the principle. In principle, so we're only making an in principle decision, but I get that. So the point that Councillor Foss says that whilst it's in principle, if we attempt to confirm it, we've only confirmed it on that basis. So what I think you should be able to do is to write a few pieces of words that adds to the MOU as being an initial document for this purpose, or something like that.
Okay, well, more than happy for Leanne to help me with those words as we go through the recs.
Yeah, we'll do that. Okay.
Because in principle, I do not believe this council should take on board the liability, contingent or otherwise, of other council decision unless we're fully indemnified.
Agreed with that, 100%.
Thank you.
Exactly right. I think you've got.
Did Leanne get that?
You want to ask a question? Because it may come, Councillor Curtin.
That's a no, Mr Chair.
You're looking very uncertain there.
Distant third on Councillor of the Day.
It's like, which one?
Well, you're throwing me into disarray, Mr Chair.
Fantastic. I'd like to do it again.
And I will take these questions out of order if you don't mind, Chris. I just want to follow on from Councillor Foss in terms of the agreements and understandings and potential discussion with the local authorities around what this means for them, and then I'll come back to where I wanted to start. Just following on then, in terms of the planning and planning framework for the TAs, there are a number of significant comments in the Daesh report around the inadequacy of their plans and their framework, particularly in regard to they're simply non-directive in their plans. What expectations would we have of them to come up with comprehensive coastal plans and accountabilities? Would that be part of that discussion?
Look, I certainly think so. One of the key issues that we need to guard against is, should any structures or protection go ahead, is that moral hazard where there's intensification of value behind a protection structure, which can potentially make it very difficult to remove it later on. So I think a lot of that does need to be strengthened. The district councils have received this information, and there have been some work packages that with the district councils that have come out of that information, as simple as aligning some of their rules and some of their plans. So it is one of the key risks around protection structures. So I guess the challenge is we can't directly control what they do and what they say in terms of their plans.
Sure, but do they appreciate that we will require them to put the protections in terms of their development? And I note that in the report, in the Daesh report, there was a significant lack of information about coastal processes to base their plans, just as they are for us. Do you envisage that being a point of discussion with Council in terms of if they want various protections to proceed, will we have an expectation that they will align their planning processes to the regional council's obligations?
Yes, I think that's part of the benefit of, I guess, part of the proposed structure is to have those councils advising the strategy, and I think that's also a mechanism to push back to the councils around expectations.
Yes.
And look, again, that's something that I think we can try and work through with the MOU on around expectations around both sides. Councils are already doing some things. For example, I think in Whirinaki there's a requirement for houses to be removable. So some of that is already there, and what we haven't recognised is that there isn't a consistency between the various district councils. So that's certainly something that we would want to see and work on, so there's a consistent approach.
Chair, could I just add that this coastal strategy process was particularly noted and looked at by the Resource Management Review Panel and the development of their advice to government, and played a role in the thinking around regional spatial strategies and the need for combined plans. So the current proposals before Parliament that are likely to be enacted over the next 12 months do try to address these issues around natural hazards and the lack of coordination that has historically occurred within the coastal environment, the terrestrial environment, between regional councils, territorial authorities and territorial authorities that have boundaries and common issues. So I think at the national level we're moving into a planning framework that's going to address the very issues that you're talking about.
Yep.
Ahead of that, there is a dialogue occurring right now, which the Chairman and I are engaged in this evening with our counterparts within the region about a regional spatial strategy that gets ahead of that statutory process,
Yep.
precisely because of the issues you're raising.
Sure. Okay, well, just if I could comment, Mr. Chair, where I'm coming to with that is the reality of the situation for those councils in coming to a conclusion on this is on the basis that we must put these processes in place, that it's simply not a done deal unless we have that, and that ought to be part of the transition dialogue.
We accept
Agreed.
that. And there's, put it another way, if there was a resource consent to be put in, or a drawing or something, then it'll have to get a resource consent, and the resource consent process will require whatever we do to comply with plans.
Sure.
So we never get around that.
Yeah, I totally concur with you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if I could follow with two lines of questioning.
Two lines of questioning. Two questions or two lines?
2 lines of questioning.
Oh, I'm worried about.
Mr. Chair, just Chris, going to the table at paragraph 18 of the paper, and we've talked about that being something in play for a 10-year period. The first question is, dare I suggest that it's probably out of date already, that there will be parameters there that would likely change that already. Would you have any view on that?
Look, I think the latest information on sea level rise, etc., will be taken on board. I don't think it's necessarily makes it out of date. We have stress tested a lot of these options, okay. And we're reasonably comfortable we're not going to enter a situation where if the latest information is worse than the previous information, that we're totally on the wrong tact. We should point out that any of these proposed structures or proposed treatments really defers the inevitable.
That's exactly.
And you'll see in that table,
Yeah.
even after 50 years, in some of those locations, we're already indicating a managed retreat.
Yeah, no, that's probably my point, and it gets down to the level of investment we're prepared to make with that inevitability around. For example, if we'd made a decision in Clifton 20 years ago and said, we're out of here, we're not going to do revetment, we did that, and probably millions of dollars have been spent in that 2 decades to protect, 20 landowner or property owners in that location. So I'm suggesting we need to be much more diligent in making the decision. And my question actually, Mr. Chair, is what would our science team and our regulatory team and our policy team be saying if they had a blank sheet of paper now? And I appreciate the half a decade of consultation and build-up of this, somewhat driven by alternate views. What would our team say? We're looking to this for us to take responsibility. What would our guys say about this time frame, strategy, adopting a strategy for intervention when the inevitability is retreat?
So I think we've done a lot of work around managed retreat, and there is a significant impact to a lot of properties, and I think it's mentioned here the number of properties and the likely value of those properties. So there is a significant loss incurred if we do nothing. Where that loss lies, I guess, is up for debate, but that loss far eclipses the cost of deferring some of that activity. So a lot of this is around deferring a managed retreat process for many of those locations. In terms of if we use what we know now in state-of-the-art planning documents, it would be fair to say that some of the areas where there are dwellings would simply not be zoned.
Yeah,
but we can't. You know, we have what we have to deal with.
We could possibly have an offline conversation about that, because I'm curious to know why in 50 years' time the properties will have plummeted in value, and that will make a decision then, which is different to today. I'm curious as to know why we've come to a counterintuitive conclusion on that, but I won't trouble with that at the moment. I just want to be satisfied that our team, with our parameters and the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement obligations and our own coastal policy plan, have been sufficiently enabled and adhered to in terms of these pathways.
Yeah.
And I'm really conscious of ensuring that our own team, in-house, our science team, etc., aren't being given the middle finger in terms of their input into the science.
No, so a few things there. So what I would say is our coastal policy predates the national coastal policy, so that is noted. Mm-hmm. We, as a project team, were very concerned about launching into a program that was unconsentable. So part of the logic behind the Mitchell-Dace report was to determine whether we could navigate the consenting processes with the pathways. And that report, it says quite a few things, but one of the key recommendations is that on the whole, the pathways are consentable under the current environment. So that gives us a level of surety that we're not about to embark on something we cannot obtain consents on. But it is fair to say some of those documents may change over time.
Can I
just respond as well? Can I just say that the point about this is that this policy and this strategy has been led by HBRC more than anybody else. The chair of it previously was Peter Bevan, who took on the board, supported by council staff. Jeff has taken over things, supported by council staff. I think there could be no doubt that this strategy is informed and driven and guided by our science
I
team.
challenge that all the way down the line. However, that's a different discussion,
Well,
having sat on it for 3 years. But, Mr Chair, let's not quibble. We're going in
Actually,
the
that-
same
that-
direction.
Mr Chair, I actually couldn't hear that comment. Can you maybe
Councillors,
repeat
that
that? I
all
couldn't
the way
hear
down
it.
Well, I believe, in my view, having sat on the panel for a 3-year period, that this is has been a consultative process engaging with the TAs and major stakeholders with a vested interest, and that we've arrived at a compromise position which is different than one if we set our own agenda from day one. That is, took our own policy statements, the New Zealand coastal policy statement, and abided by that. I think we've arrived at a different. I think we would structure this differently, but it is what it is, and I'm accepting that at face value.
okay, well, let's move on.
Yep. So I just want to finally, if I could, sorry to burden you, Mr Chair.
I'm always burdened. But carry on.
I just want to go to this notion of moral hazard, which the Daesh report really does a good job in distilling. And they say it can be defined as a situation where an individual has an incentive to increase their exposure to risk because they do not bear the full cost. And my concern is that, and forgive me for labouring the earlier discussion on rating before, where general funds are applied, so everyone pays. So what we're dealing with moral hazard is that everyone, whether they live in Central Hawke's Bay or Wairoa, paying for a small, relatively small number of property owners who've made a decision to buy in an exposed and risky area, and that moral hazard that arises from that. Have we taken that into cognizance when we design a process to spend 15 million in the first 7-year period to protect those properties?
So, look, the rating regime will most likely be a targeted rate regime, and so that's where the people who are benefiting the most are also paying the most for that benefit. So, what is untested is the component of general rate funding. So if you look at our river flooding schemes, for example, pretty much every scheme has a different ratio between the targeted rate proportion and the general rated portion. And so some of that comes into an affordability test as to whether the beneficiaries can simply afford the rating impost. So it's certainly not going forward with the view that everyone will pay equally no matter where they live, and only coastal people will receive the benefit. The model that we're pursuing is that as much of the cost that can be borne by the beneficiaries will be paid by the beneficiaries, and so that they'll ultimately paying the lion's share, if not all, of the costs associated with this particular program.
Well, can I just say to you, Chris, that that answer doesn't satisfy me, because when it comes down to the basis that what can I afford to pay, of course, people say I can't afford to pay this.
Yep.
I've got to have a clear line. The clear line should be those who benefit pay. That's it. I think it cannot be that. Otherwise, we get ourselves in a position that Neil is into. Very happy to do this as long as someone else is paying the cost. I think we've got to be very hard on this. Otherwise, we'll have a massive amount of cross-subsidisation. I think we've got to have some very clear lines. So I'm very clear on that. Those who benefit, pay.
So maybe, Ross, I think that the affordability is part of the test. Ross, can you mention?
It is a test under the rating.
Under the Rating Act, there is an affordability test.
There is an affordability test. But look, can I just suggest that before we're going to go to the community with a proposed targeted rate of any sort to fund this, there are significant questions of public-private benefit, moral hazard, etc., that need to be worked through. That's well beyond the scope of today's paper and our ability to satisfy those questions today. So can I suggest we take those to further workshopping? but the concerns are all noted, and we need to provide you with more extensive advice on
That's
this.
right, and I'm really happy for that, because the thing I responded quite sharply was that in the paper, the numbers in here are written up as if a general rate is being applied. That leaves people with a clear impression that everybody's going to pay for all of this. And if I was in a position which was, and my home was on the endanger list, I would celebrate this, because I've got now 160,000 people helping me pay for my protection. Well, that's an unrealistic position. There's going to be some very hard and sharp conversations about this, and if we signal that, well, I think Neil's point is well made, and I support him on that. Yes, there's other considerations, but it's going to be a tough conversation. Anyway.
Thank you for coming back to us. So I'm looking at your table on page 37, and one of the tasks there that is still to come is our LTP amendment.
Yep.
And I'm guessing we're going out for public consultation then, with a whole lot of work that's going to be done. That looks a lot like corporate and strategic work,
Yep.
which is great. But at what stage do we inform the public about the ecological issues with what's proposed here?
So, so through that process, so we've commenced a piece of work to better understand the ecological issues, and so that's something that we're keen to hear from the community about. Some of the initial feedback is the part of the coast that we would be working in is a high energy part of the coast, which doesn't support a wide variety of biodiversity. So that's just a high level summary. But we are doing more work in that area, and we'll do more detailed work as we're entering the consenting process. But we have a wide range of engagement, pretty much commencing now with tangata whenua. We've got 13 or so hui lined up to get a lot of that feedback. We've got a pre-consultation process and then a consultation process. So at a high level, we can describe what some of those impacts may be, but the detail of that probably won't occur until we're actually in a consenting process. And part of that is we probably wouldn't commence that work until we know that we're going forward with the program or not. But certainly in the high level work, I think we're able to articulate the high level impact or not.
So just supplementary, Chair?
Yes.
You'll say yes to anything, right?
Yeah, no, I was listening to
So could you say we're going out for public consultation with information about the economic view more than we are the environmental, ecological views of what the strategy is proposing for the future in that consultation process?
Yeah, I think thinking of the previous environmental work, Simon.
Well, what I'd add,
Cultural work.
yeah, and what I'd add to that, I think we'll be going out with the preferred option, whatever that might look like, but also the primary alternatives, which will include like an early retreat response, right? So it's a full range of options that get put out there for comment and consideration alongside the pros and cons of each. So I don't think it's a case of saying, here's one option we like, give us your feedback. It's more about a range of potential options with this preferred one identified. So it's the full package will be going out. The ecological work, we've got a gap analysis now being completed showing where we don't know stuff and need to know more, and we'll fill those gaps with more monitoring over time. So it is a work in progress, but I think it's broader than just the economic picture going out for consultation.
My question to Councillor Ormsby is, what do you see as, or do you perceive as being missing here?
If I go back to the paper in 71, it proposes a coastal ecology work stream that's still to be, that mahi's still to be done, right?
It's started.
Yeah, it started.
So we have the gap analysis now.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so 71.3 talks about burying benthic communities beneath controlled structures.
Yeah.
So to me, that talks about suffocating habitat, possible habitat areas.
That's right.
So that's a huge concern that I think the community might want to know about, those issues in terms of the options that are being put up. I think it's our duty to inform them on those ecological issues when we go out for public consultation as much as we can.
Chair, could I make the observation that the chicken and egg of this is that until we raise sufficient revenue to undertake all of the technical work that includes those ecological studies, there are many unanswered questions. So I think what's important in terms of framing any conversation with the community about an LTP amendment to raise resources is that we have a strategy that has been developed in consultation with the community, but it gives rise to a series of questions. Issues of equity, issues of funding, issues of ecological impact. What we really are seeking to do is raise some resources so that technical work can be done, and then we can provide the community with the information base that will then subsequently lead to confirming or otherwise whether those interventions in the strategy are appropriate and going to be pursued.
Is that helpful?
For now, yeah.
Martin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions for Chris, and then I'd obviously want to speak to the paper a bit later. But Chris, can you take me to table 2? I think I understood your explanation to be that in terms of an operating budget, year 6, it was assumed $1 million, 2 million, year 8, 2.5 million, and those are principally consenting costs. Is that what you?
So what I was suggesting is you need to read the two tables together in terms of our first cut of the financials. So we've allowed two full-time staff, so that's commencing in year 2, so that's 300,000 for staff and overheads. The top line is our renourishment, so that kicks in at year 6. When you look at what those staff are spending, we need to look at the capital expenditure, which has 250 in year 2, 250 in year 3, and 500 in year 4. So that's effectively $1 million towards consenting processes and activities that those resourced staff would manage. So that's
So you're saying table 3 is the consenting cost, not table 2?
Table 3.
Table 3.
Those first 3 years.
We capitalise the consenting process, and so they sit within the capital budget.
Okay, all right. So you're assuming 250,000. Okay, a total of about $1 million of cost.
That's correct, and it is a starting point. And I'll probably reiterate it. It assumes that we go through a staged process, and we probably haven't allowed for any, I guess, significant activity to go through environment court or anything like that.
Well, yeah, someone's got you right, but over it. But operating budget and renourishment on the first line of table 2. What is the $1 million, 2 million, 3 million operating cost?
So that's effectively bringing gravel, and we've picked a midpoint in the upper Tuki scheme to renourish around those structures.
And that's what you're talking about with the carbon costs.
Yep, and we've included a carbon offset cost into those.
So that's gravel for you. Okay, my final question is this. But look, it's really just to get a scenario. My colleagues to sort of think of a scenario here of how this is going to work and get some thoughts from you, Chris, on this week. Because let's say it's 26, and the trigger in the coastal hazard plan says go on West Shore renourishment. Really what I'm just trying to find out or get a flavour of exactly how is this going to work. Because I think we all need to understand exactly what this organisation is potentially taking on here. Is someone or some staff, newly rated and funded staff, going to put a consent application together for that renourishment and take it through the process, the consenting process, and then come to the council once for a yes/no decision as to whether it goes ahead and to make decisions around rating allocation? Or do you envisage that right at the beginning, before even deciding to enter the consent process, you would come up to council and ask the question about whether this project is to be consented at all? How do you see that working?
So, look, in terms of projects, I would envisage they effectively become part of the infrastructure strategy. So they're approved through an LTP process or pre-approved through an LTP process. And when those triggers are met, staff will do the activities necessary to implement those pre-approved projects. So I wouldn't foresee every project coming to council for separate approval, just like none of the projects in any of our flood control schemes come back to council for separate decisions. We present our infrastructure strategy, which is incorporated into the LTP. Significant projects are discussed and are effectively approved through that process. And so every 3 years, we get to review that infrastructure strategy and LTP in detail, and staff would also be adjusting the cash flow depending on the current signals and triggers and what they're seeing in the environment. So in my mind, that's how I'm seeing it work going forward as part of the infrastructure strategy adopted through the LTP.
But can I just answer the same question, I think slightly differently but similarly? The point of having the strategy is we've consulted with the community and we've said in this particular area we think renourishment is the option. And we've consulted with the community and we've told them this is what we think the actual costs are. And in consulting with the community, we've basically said this is how the costs will fall. And then in consulting with the community, they've said, oh, well, we get the impression from the community, we'll get that that's acceptable. So that point gets in the strategy. And so when the trigger comes, the initiative is taken on the basis of consultation, clearly understood, clearly signalled issues. And so it then goes through. So I would have thought council, by adopting the strategy in conjunction with the community, would be clear that this is what the intention was. Pending a final decision on what the structure was and what the actual costs were, at that point you go back and say, well, we've had this idea, this is what it is, this is what the cost is, this is what the amount is. And the community has to then finally say, yes, we accept that, or no, we don't. And if it's yes, it's built. If it's no, it's not. Simple as that.
Thank you.
Right.
Just
Councillor Foley.
hopefully quick, thanks, Chair. You mentioned offsetting the carbon as a result of the work, so I assume that means it's significant. And what does that look like?
Oh, so offsetting the carbon was looking at the effectively the carbon footprint of the transportation activity, and then pricing that against the current carbon price, and then coming up with a dollar figure.
And so what was that carbon price that was assumed?
I haven't got that right here. I do know that it's been incorporated into the costings.
Because that's obviously quite a risk. I mean, look at how much it's gone up in the last.
Yeah, it would be a small fraction of the overall cost under the current allocation and under the current regime. So just like if you offset a flight, it's a few dollars. You pay $500 for a flight. The offset costs are $10 or something. Like it's a small proportion of the overall cost. Look, it is I think an issue that people will be worried about, and one of the greatest, I think, challenges of this program is the sheer volume of material that our analysis at the moment suggests needs to occur, and it's something that we would manage very carefully going forward. This is based on computer models that have been built, so it gives us an indication, but we'd certainly be looking to reduce that activity. And it's effectively to offset the downstream effects of any structure is the reason that we put it in.
Because I assume the reason we've got to this point with rising sea levels is because of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to start with. So it just seems a little bit ironic that we're contributing to the problem to try and prevent the problem.
But if he's offsetting it, he's mitigating it, so it should be neutral. Councillor Foss has indicated he'd like a supplementary.
Well, yeah, just to that, I just see, I don't know if the finance team have seen that, because we have carbon credits on our balance sheet. We are a carbon positive council. So I don't understand why, isn't the right answer, we've used exactly the same as we use for the rest of the council, whatever that rate is, and therefore that will follow through into the various budgets. So, because everyone acknowledges it's a significant issue, but I'm just a wee bit disturbed that, I don't mean you should know to the nearest dollar, but is it consistent with the rest of the policies and metrics that the council are using insofar as carbon's concerned?
In terms of the cost of carbon, it would be consistent with because it's a market. So it's an internal price transfer is what you'd be doing, because we're in credit. We've used an external cost, and maybe I just get that information and send it out. Might be useful.
So what we haven't estimated is whether the total carbon emissions of undertaking this work could be netted off by the council's NZU's portfolio. That work hasn't been done.
Right, but that's obviously an option at the proper transfer price.
That's right, yes.
Okay, just needs to be tightened up.
All right, so I'm looking forward to make some progress here. So would somebody like to move resolution?
I'll move.
Bank? Moved. You wanting a second, Councillor?
I'll second, and I do flag a couple of amendments, Chair.
All right, well, why don't you put the amendments up on the deck and we have a look at them. The mover might accept them.
Okay, I've sent them to Leanne. Just pursuant to my earlier discussion, colleagues, it's just in addition to resolution or recommendation 3. Are you putting them up? Basically, it just extends that last one, which ends to coastal hazard strategy. Then we open up, including but not limited to, new 3.1, recognition and acknowledgement of legal responsibilities, 3.2. Assessment of risk and liabilities associated with the transfer to HBRC of the management of existing coastal hazards mitigation assets held by Napier City Council and Hastings District Council, and the transfer of existing rock, is that the right word? Revetments at Waimarama, Clifton, Cape View Corner and Ahuriri. I just have a question on my own. Shouldn't we include the other councils in this?
No, nobody else.
Okay, well, that's what I'll put into as an amendment, Mr. Chair.
What's the second one?
So,
3.1, 3.2.
Yeah, but you've got this other blue.
4. That may be Neil.
Neil, were you wanting to propose?
So I'm currently talking and putting that up, so...
Yeah, but I just want, just so we get visibility, it's just easier, if people got amendments, put them all up on the deck and we then see...
Oh, don't worry, I shouldn't read it out, it's not mine, it's Neil's.
Oh, yeah, no, that's what I'm saying, so Neil, you've got an amendment.
Well, in addition to Councillor Foss's additional recommendation or as a decision, I'm proposing that we also include this.
I can't see that. I don't know if...
Oh, sorry. Why don't I email it through?
Yes.
Oh, you did? Thank you.
So you're asking for a review on these things before we go to council?
Before we actually proceed to...
Chair, can I just check with Chris? I think matters 4.1 to 4.7 have been to a greater or less extent canvassed to date, but we can pull that together and build on it. Is there anything in there which is not doable?
Look,
your view?
To me, the detail required, or the expectation around detail against those points is important. If the expectation is very detailed analysis of all of those points, is it meaning a new review of the policy and regulatory framework? We've done a review of the policy and regulatory framework that exists. We have assessed that we have a viable program in terms of consentability under the policy and regulatory framework.
Well, can I just inquire of that, Mr. Chair? You're saying that, and they are papers, and I'm assuming you're referring to the Daesh report in regard to that. So they're papers that have been processed through the Hazards Committee, right? So Council itself hasn't had eyes on directly with those. Is that correct? Other than
the full council hasn't. No, representatives of this council have.
So what what I'm looking for is an internal review of those areas and perhaps using, for example, just a review of the review taking place of the DASH report, for example, to tell us what we think of those, or the regional council think of those particular areas.
Can I just put just a question of this? What I'm getting a sense here, if this is at a very detailed level, staff are saying it's too big a job for them to do, it'll affect other things.
Well,
just let me finish. What I think I'm hearing from staff is if they pull this together at a high level and go through it, it's eminently doable. If it's just reviewing and pulling together the existing stuff and put it that'll work reasonably well. Is that okay with you?
Well, it's moderately satisfactory, but not entirely. And if I could explain that, is that this council needs to have its lens over it, and we need certainty that, one, that we can deliver this from an organisational perspective, just the simple maths of doing the job. The DASH report, for example, is telling us that our policy and regulatory framework is inadequate to actually enable us to consent these things. We don't have enough information. Our science outputs are inadequate. That's what that's telling us. So if you're saying that a review is only, yes, confirming what's already there, which doesn't actually give us answers. So I'd like to know from the science team, for example, how would we get to sufficient information and data to properly, if you like, consent a structure?
So, Chair, look, we couldn't apply for consent tomorrow, right?
Yep.
So everybody accepts that there's a significant amount of science and technical work that would need to be done. The idea, obviously, with the funding and the strategy was to undertake that work. And I guess what we've done prospectively with the sorts of numbers that have been provided is look at what does a 10-year program look like built into an LTP amendment that not only does that pre-work but also delivers the solution. Now, that requires a leap of faith by ratepayers and councillors that you're going to provide for on a 10-year basis, noting that every 3 years, obviously, we review all of our funding and all of our financial forecasts, but that you are making provision for something that has not yet been consented and still requires a significant amount of work. In terms of resolving those information gaps on some of the science and technical questions, until we get some additional resourcing, there wouldn't be capacity within our current science team. And similarly, so we haven't, for the policy team, built into our work program a review of the Mitchell-Dash assessment to come up with some independent advice or council staff advice to you on those consenting pathway issues and on the adequacy of the RCP. So what I'd like to do, I'm just wondering how we amend the wording here, is to be able to go away with the management team and have a conversation about the doability of some of this.
Well, if I could comment on that.
So, and then come back to council. So perhaps if we had a wording here along the right lines of request staff report back to council on these matters, and we provide a further report on the resourcing implications of undertaking that work, particularly in the time frame that we were working to.
Well, if it's helpful to remove the word review and put report back on, that would be fine with me. And I'm thinking about the DASH report says you haven't got enough data. I'd like to know, okay, what timeline would it take and what resources would it take to get enough data? I'm not saying go and get the data. I'm saying what's the plan to meet what I think is a very tight timetable to deliver this thing.
Well, I think that's a nub of it. So what I'm concerned about was we've got here is a resolution in principle. We're not deciding it, it's in principle. So it's at a very high level in principle. We haven't decided to do this, so we're a step away from making a decision. But it also there's a lot of unknowns here, or I think. So what if we have the report from the staff as to a pathway to what do they perceive today, the pathway and the timeline, the resources necessary to get to this? I think that's very helpful.
Is that doable, Chris?
Look, absolutely. In the example, we have kicked off work as a result of that Mitchell-Dash report, and we can bring you, what that report has informed us. So the joint committee has probably seen a lot more of that detail, and I think bringing some of that detail to this table through workshops, etc., is doable. New analysis or significant new analysis does have the potential to impact our time frame. That's not a reason not to do it, but just the acknowledgement that the resources of the project are pretty much maxed out. We're deciding what work we can't afford to do, and we are on a very tight time frame.
Yeah, I get that, but what I get from Councillor Curtin is that he wants to see that we've got sight of this and is acknowledged, and there is a pathway which he can see and identify and is credible. So we've got that. I think we're satisfied with that. So just...
Point of order, Mr Chairman.
I've got Councillor Williams coming. Can I just hold you for a moment and come back to Councillor Foss?
It's not on a point of order, you can't, I don't think.
Oh, you got a point of order?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, point of order.
Oh,
Are we putting a motion on an amended motion here, or are we debating it?
Well,
Refine it to be.
we're refining it, actually.
Well, if we're refining it, can I add something to it, please?
Sure, but I'll let you come in and refine something shortly. I just want to go to Councillor Foss on the amendment you've got there. Is there anything you'd like to sort of clarify about that?
Well, I take responsibility for the 3.1, 3.2 and the change to the first one. So no, there has been very little conversation about that. So I guess that means it's generally supported by colleagues. Most of the conversations are around 4. I think it's a good point, report backing. I mean, no one's trying to interrupt here. It's just to help facilitate. I think their wordsmith in there is very good. Defer to Councillor Curtin, who promoted this, but I'm comfortable with what you've got there on the screen.
Okay, I'm just trying to get the... Councillor Williams, you've got something you'd like to add to this?
Well, thank you, and I think you've all heard me talk about this, but I think if there's going to be a report, it should include recommendations as to the most appropriate organisational structure to ensure effective implementation of the strategy.
That's a fair point.
So look, no problems with that, adding that in. So perhaps just in 4.1, organisational wide impacts, including appropriate delivery arrangements or delivery models, something like that.
That's too vague. What I'm wanting to see here is the most appropriate organisational structure to ensure effective delivery of the strategy.
Okay.
Sort of impacts and work on the most appropriate organisational structure for delivery of the projects.
Effective delivery.
Well, delivery is effective. If it's ineffective, it's not delivered.
No, well,
So you're charging me by the word here, Martin.
no, I'm not. If the words are not in there, I won't be happy with the motion. So I can speak to that when we get to the appropriate point, which is why I raised the point of order.
So they're part of 4.1. So adding it.
4.1. Most effective organisational model for the implementation.
Of the strategy.
Of the strategy. Implementation of the strategy.
I just wanted this. The other reason I raised the point of order is that I think a lot of what is in 4.1 to 4.6 would come out through implementation of the strategy because, for example, and this is why I asked whether we were debating the motion or putting it, the suitability of the policy and regulatory framework. Well, in 2026, we won't have an RMA. We might have a Kotahi plan. We won't have an NZ CPS, or it'll be very different. We'll have a CCRA, Climate Change Response Act. And I really sort of wonder whether we are asking our staff to do a whole bunch of work now, for example, on ratepayer equity or obligations to tangata whenua, that really is more suitably project specific. And we could do all of that now. Yeah, just to pick up James's point, we're sort of shooting at shadows. We don't even know what the project is. So I just table that point. I'm not sure that all of that work, if it's too in depth, will be useful at the end of the day.
Thank you. Now we've got an amended motion. So what I'm trying to do is get a motion that we've all got a sense of. Everyone's had a put in, and we're from governor's point of view, from staff point of view, this is workable for us. So we've kind of got to that point now. We've got a mover and a seconder.
So, Chair, just before you move to debate, just perhaps confirming, I think from a staff point of view, and in response to Councillor Williams, the report back on this may be that on some of these matters we can't provide advice in a timely manner with the resources we have, and that will need to be provided for. I think the key choice confronting councillors is how much information certainty do you want about how the strategy is going to be delivered prior to going to the community to raise some resources to deliver the strategy, and how much will be worked out along the way. That is going to be the key balance in all of this.
Sure, that's exactly right. But anyway, I think this is a really good start. Councillor Van Beek, you're the mover.
Yep.
Please.
So I totally agree with Martin. And sitting on the most of the time sitting at the technical advisory group, you see a lot more in depth the work that the staff are doing and how much we actually as a council are leading. And once again, I don't think anyone around this table will really know, not even Chris or Simon, what this whole strategy is going to look like in 20 years' time, because we are here boxing with shadows, and especially with the amount of policy work that is actually are being worked on right now, needs implementing. We're short of capability within our council, but not just our council, other councils around the country. And so we're having some real issues here. But I believe that the motion that is put hopefully won't go into much detail that we're not able to achieve prior to consultation. That's my main worry about this, but hey, it is there. It's a safety valve that we've got in place. But I also believe that now is actually the time to act. You know, if we don't act as a council, this work will completely fall flat on its face, because the TAs, I believe, just haven't got the ability to work together and see actually themselves through this whole conundrum of climate change, erosion, and sea level rise. So I think it is upon ourselves to really look, as the report said from Reino Asher, that we are the entity that really needs to take this on board. And what this is going to look like, we don't know. But at least we're giving ourselves a good chance that we help those who are on the coast, who actually have invested on the coast, whether it is personal property or whether it's TAs with roads, electrical networks, and so forth, that we actually are able to support them in the best way we can. And I think we are the entity to do that. And this motion just being in principle, I'm comfortable with that. We're not signing any big cheques, although cheques are out these days. We're not signing the cheques, but at least we're giving direction in this particular area, which is actually very important. So all I've got to say, and no doubt consultation will indicate how this community, our community, is willing to do this work and willing to pay for it as well. And I totally agree, user pay is very important, because that then we actually will get the right support of the people who are needed to be supported in this particular area.
Thanks, Jeff. Councillor Foss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just thanks everyone for help banging this one into shape, or a bit more shape. And just note, yes, we've taken lead, particularly the items there in 4.1 through 6 or 7.
Yeah.
It's about concern that this can be huge. The obligations here, the resources, the cost, the physical infrastructure, or whatever. And there's a rock starting to roll down the mountain here. And so the concern is that we are as fully prepared with the knowledge we have now and flexible enough to change in the future to make the best and informed decisions we can on the way through, rather than just grab this because no one else is doing it. And I think we've come a long way in the last few weeks to shape this up. Look forward to the next bits, and I welcome our colleague councils who are mentioned in this in particular to join us or to work with us as we try and solve this one. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other speakers? Councillor Curtin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been a bit of a journey for me, having been on the panel, having seen the earliest work for it to address the issues. And when looking at this at the first glance, my reaction was, let's not go anywhere near this with a barge pole. And for I believe the good reason that it's almost like the tar baby. You put your hands on it and you get stuck, and you're stuck with it. And the ratepayer will be stuck with it for a long time to come. So that's my hesitation. I saw the light, Mr. Chair, with your intervention and a good conversation with Councillor Bake, and I saw the opportunity, in fact, to make very significant investments in our knowledge, understanding and respect for the coastal environment. And I'm seeing this as a way in which we can improve and avoid the abuse which we've hurled at it for decade upon decade. And I look forward to the views of the science team, for example, as to what they need to research and understand as a part of their process. But the issues go much broader than that, that particular favourable outcome from my perspective. The other one of concern to me is what the impacts are on the organisation as a whole. I am interested to have conversations with the asset manager and other staff about the depth and scope that this project brings to the table, brings to the council, and it's simply not constrained just to engineering, asset management. It's across the board. We know immediately that our policy and regulatory framework is completely inadequate, not completely, has several inadequacies which we need to resolve. That'll be a good thing, but that'll involve a great deal of discussion and dialogue with the policy and analysts, the planners around achieving that. Similarly with our team from so the asset management, we've got our corporate team who need to resolve and fund this thing. We've got the regulatory environment itself. So we've got many parts of the organisation that needs to come into play. And I note Councillor Williams' observation, and a good one, that we come and look at the most realistic way of managing this organisationally. And I would suggest that it's simply not something left to the asset management team. It's something that the whole organisation needs to be contributing to. And then we go wider than that. It's like a rippling pool, Mr. Chair, where what is the impact overall to the ratepayer? What is it that we're asking the ratepayer to do? And I have no apology, make no apology whatsoever for asking for more detail on what that pathway looks like. I hear the soothing words about targeted rates, but that's simply unrealistic. The whole community will pay for this, whether they live in Wairoa or Central Hawke's Bay. Go back to those early discussions, and forgive me for anticipating this discussion and debate when diving into the rating issues we discussed earlier. I did want to emphasise that the general rate and other investment commitments will pay for a good chunk of this work. The whole community will be paying for this work, and therefore the whole community needs to know that they're paying for this work. And I just reject the notion that somehow we can put this in a little box and say it's targeted rate, because that's only part of the story. Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity and your guidance on this. You have really made me see the light, and I'm happy to support it on the proviso that we proceed in the direction that's been foreshadowed in recommendations 3 and 4 that we're considering now.
Thank you. Councillor Foley.
Thank you, Chair. Following on from that, and following on from a significant LTP that we've just been through and some pretty big numbers there, I was obviously drawn straight to the rating and debt tables in this paper, and like colleague Councillor Curtin got a bit of a shock when I opened this paper, so you can imagine my hesitation. But look, notwithstanding targeted rates, this will, depending on the outcomes going forward, will impact on this organisation with extra staff and pressure on what already is under pressure, achieving what it needs to achieve. Look, I suspect things will change reasonably quickly, in the years ahead, and probably well ahead of 2010, maybe even 5 years. The official reports now, 2023 will be worldwide our biggest year for carbon emissions ever. So, thank God for our climate emergencies. Imagine how bad we could be otherwise. So I suspect that, perhaps an outcome will be managed retreat sooner than we think. So I'll support this at this stage. Thank you.
Any other speakers? I just make... Martin, did you have your wave?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, look, I the point about organisational structure, if I could just very briefly share where I'm coming from, it's kind of a separation of powers argument. And I think if we're going to be effective with this, we can't, as councillors, be judge and legislator. We're going to have to need to give our asset management team, whoever it is, a free hand, because this is going to be an incredibly challenging consenting proposition. And the recent experiences we've got consenting Clyde River dredging, for example, or gravel, just a testament to that. This is probably unprecedented other than the dam, which was run through a CCO, in terms of just how complicated this is going to be. So that those guys, whoever's doing that, is going to need every tailwind they can get and no headwinds. So I see there as a consenting arm through which the ecological and the public concerns around a specific proposal and mana whenua engagement happens when you've actually got something tangible in front of you, rather than trying to shoot at all of that now. That will be the opportunity to get the public involved in the environmental implications, downstream coastal processes, ecology. Then the second arm of council is policy planning. We are, through Kotahi, going to need to deliver, in our marine context, a plan which currently gives effect to the NZCPS, but by the time we're there may be a new NZCPS and there may not even be an RMA. So the Mitchell-Dace paper said there are opportunities to shape our next coastal plan in a way that actually embraces this strategy. So I think trying to judge the future fate of these projects on what we've got in front of us now is... it's not helpful. And then, the third part of it is as consent authority. These will probably go to independent commissioners. They'll go to the Environment Court through direct referral or whatever it might be. And provided we keep the organisational structure alive to the need to realise which each part of the organisation is best doing, this can work. But if we don't, and we get it all tangled up and everyone thinks that they should be all over all of it, it will fail. That is my very real concern. I support the motion. I thank Councillor Foss for the additions on issues of risk and liability. I think that's sensible. And I welcome the report in terms of what would be the most effective organisational structure. So this thing's got the best chance it can have for what will be an incredibly challenging proposition at all levels. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. I'll just make one comment. I just welcome this because the key point for me is, firstly, that this is in principle decision. We're not making a decision here to commit it here. There's lots of outs. But more importantly, like Councillor Curtin, I was very uncomfortable with this coming to the Regional Council because of all the problems that it's going to have. But in the end, I felt that it had to come here because at the moment there's just so many hands on this issue that nothing was being done. And so I in the end concluded that the Regional Council has to step forward and take one for the team to be the point of contact for this. There can be no other organisation do it. It's going to be a burden, it's going to be a problem, but it's something that just has to be done. The last thing I would add on this is I disagree seldom with Councillor Curtin, but I do disagree with him on this point, where he says the whole community, including Wairoa, will pay for this. I see this as a matter between Clifton and Tangoyo. The people who live in those areas will be the ones who will take responsibility for the bill. The only time it'll ever get to Wairoa is if this is extended to Wairoa for their own thing. I see no argument at all for the ratepayers in Wairoa to be paying for infrastructure in protecting the Heretaunga Plains. None whatsoever. And if it comes to that, I'll campaign against the council on it myself. But anyway, this is one for the future. I'll now turn over to Jeff to close if he wishes to add something.
Yeah, I've actually got not much to add except for we've got quite a few regional parks that a very, very large of our population never sets foot in. And I'll leave it at that, because that's really what I get to hear, that the people in the hills possibly have no benefit from the work that we do here. But I think it's something we need to do as a council. We need to be brave, and it is difficult. As my colleague Will Foley said, opening it up and seeing the rates that we possibly will be rating in due time will be large and not expected. Although if it's going to happen and occur anyhow, it will have an HBRC logo on it. If we don't put our hand up and feel that we're the best in the best situation, it may possibly in the future have a different logo on it, but still I believe our ratepayers are wanting to proceed with this work. But no doubt we'll, through the consultation, find out what the appetite for this is, especially as we have assured Councillor Curtin that this actually is targeted rather than right across general. Thank you.
All right. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Carried. Can I just move on to the next item on the Hawke's Bay? Let me finish. On the Hawke's Bay drinking water, I'll suggest this paper be withdrawn. Come back another day.
Do you need
So
that
I'll move
moved?
the paper be withdrawn.
I can second.
Seconded Councillor Ormsby. It's a procedural motion. All those in favour will say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Carried. Councillors' remuneration allowances, item 9.
Point of order, Mr Chair. Point of order?
Yes, point of order.
It's 1:04.
Oh, yes. Where's our break?
Yeah.
Well, we're happy to break right away. There's no lunch here yet, so if you'd like to do the next two motions, we can clean up while the lunch is served.
Depends if you want to get paid or not.
Is ready? Well,
Mr Chair.
No, we're
I've
already
sure
getting
this
paid.
tucked
We
in.
don't need this to get paid. We're already getting paid.
yeah, so let's just, these last two can be done. Council remuneration allowances. This is a straightforward paper. I don't know if there's any need for debate. It's just a thing just received. So would you like to move, Councillor Curtin?
Oh, look, I'll gladly do that.
Yep.
Councillor Van Beek will second. Is there any discussion? Being none, I'll put that. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Carried. The fixing of the common seal, I'm happy to move that. Do I have a seconder?
Second it.
Councillor Van Beek. Any discussion? I'll put that. All those in favour will say aye.
Aye.
Carried. We'll adjourn for lunch.